My name is Stephanie, and I used to work in this electronic and eclectic kind of store in the mall. I bet you've seen something like this before. It had big speakers in the front windows, lit up by a ton of LEDs, as well as some of those miniature electric cars outside of the front doors. It also had those framed sports pictures that looked like they were autographed, but in reality the signatures were just printed. Personally, I thought that stuff was pretty lame, and newsflash, those electronics were very cheaply made and always broke down. Not uncommonly, an irate customer would come to the store demanding a refund. However, there was some genuinely cool stuff further back in the store. There was a section with records and CDs and even a few video games, and it was priced very reasonably. There were lots of other knickknacks too, including refrigerator magnets, stuff like bonsai trees, and centerpieces for dining room tables. Well, unfortunately that wasn't enough, because the store eventually closed down. I was just a temp worker during the summer after my junior year of high school, so I wasn't really invested. Honestly, I didn't enjoy working there, and as the summer went on, I looked forward to the end of my shifts more and more. I'm a girl, and the clientele of the store included some creepy middle-aged dudes. Occasionally a younger person came in there, but they gave off weird vibes as well. The man who owned the store was this overweight 40-year-old guy named Frank, and he was already balding. He'd frequently wear this Metallica t-shirt and jorts, and seemed to think he was a lot cooler than he was. On the upside, I usually got along with my coworkers. There were two other high school kids like me, Luke and Chrissy, though I didn't know them from school or anything. There was also this guy in his 20s named Jeremy. I vaguely remember he was somehow related to Frank, but he was really nice. Now, however creepy things were up to this point, nothing could prepare me for what happened a few days before the store finally closed its doors. The last couple weeks we spent most of our time loading things into boxes and taking them to the back of the mall where Frank loaded them into the back of his flatbed truck. I honestly had no idea where he was taking them. I'm not even sure why the store was closing, as Frank didn't want to talk about it. I assumed it was for failure to pay the rent, but who knows. In addition to packing things up, the store was also having a big going out of business sale. Even with the sale though, the stuff near the front of the store still wasn't worth buying. However, the records and some other items were, and I spent a bit of what I'd saved up getting them. Overall, there were significantly more people in the store, which included more creepy dudes, but also women and parents with their children. It was a pleasant change, but unfortunately one that wouldn't last. At one point, I had to pack up the stuff in one of the supply rooms. This room wasn't very big, maybe the size of a walk-in closet. There were speakers and soundbars and a few radios, and I had a pile of flattened cardboard boxes on the floor next to me. Halfway through packing up a box, I almost screamed as I looked up to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man who looked to be in his mid-30s. He was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie with some anime characters on it. The man was a little overweight and had a bit of a beard. We stood there for a moment, eyes locked on each other, before he eventually asked me in a quiet voice where the stereos were. There were still some at the front of the store. Did he not see them when he walked in? I told the man as such, and he did this half-nod thing before turning around and walking away. My heart was still racing from the encounter, and I finished filling the box I had and then took it over to the back door where we were staging things. I checked my surroundings and saw the man, only he wasn't at the front looking at stereos. He was standing in this aisle that had some clothes and posters on each side, but he didn't appear to be looking at any of them. Rather, when I came into view, he turned quickly away. I was now thoroughly creeped out, and I could guess what that man's intentions were. But how far he was willing to go to carry them out, I didn't know. It was around 4 p.m. and my shift lasted until 8, which was when the mall closed, and the thought of that man hanging around and stalking me filled me with dread. I decided to carry the box and a few others out to Frank's truck, and I took them one at a time so as to make it take longer. However, each time I came back, I noticed that same guy somewhere in the store. He'd be in a different aisle each time, but he'd still look away whenever I came into view. I'm not sure where everyone was at this time. I think Luke had to take off early, and Jeremy wasn't supposed to come in till 5. I don't know about Chrissy, but she didn't appear to be either in the store or loading boxes in the truck. After I returned from loading the last box and saw the man still in the store, I contemplated my options. Honestly, I didn't want to tell Frank, since he was a bit creepy himself, and he was also preoccupied with the store closing. I didn't want to go back to that room and keep filling up boxes, since I figured that man might just walk back over again, or worse. Since Frank was still by his truck, I decided to take a stroll around the mall. Frank was rather strict when it came to employees remaining in the store while it was open, and I was even the only employee there. However, that guy was seriously creeping me out, and I thought that if he followed me outside and I could lose him in a crowd, that might be the end of it, at least for a while until Jeremy got there. Therefore, I walked to the front of the store, making sure that the guy could see me as I passed by. This mall was fairly big and had 2 levels, and as I took the escalator to do a lap around the upper level, I kept checking behind me for the man. Unfortunately, I didn't see him. I walked into the Macy's and did a little loop there before walking back out and around into the JCPenney. After another minute or so, I took a separate set of escalators down and walked back to the store. Thankfully, Frank wasn't there, and the man appeared to be no longer in the store, though Jeremy wasn't there yet, meaning I was still the only employee there. I walked up and down some of the aisles, greeting a few of the customers and asking if they needed help with anything. I was also paranoid and wanted to make sure that man wasn't lurking anywhere. After I finished answering some questions, I decided to go back to that back room and continue packing up. When I got to the doorway, I stuck my head inside and looked around. I still wasn't taking any chances. The man didn't appear to be in there. I resumed filling the boxes, and after filling each box, I'd take it to the back door. Normally I wouldn't do that, but I wanted to check the store frequently to see if that guy had come back. At one point, one of the customers made eye contact with me, came over and asked me for help. After getting a step stool to get one of the posters down from the top of a shelf, I put the stool back and returned to the room. That encounter, coupled with the passing of time, apparently made me let my guard down, which was about to turn into a disaster. After I walked into the room and began placing stereos into another box, I could swear I heard something. At first I wasn't sure what it was, and wasn't even sure it was coming from in the room with me. The room was still like a fourth full with some of those big sound systems lining one of the walls, but that's when I noticed that 2 of them seemed to be moved. The realization hit all at once, and as if on cue, the man stood up. I froze, and a moment later he walked out from behind the stereos, incidentally blocking my exit. He put his hands up and made a shushing sound and walked closer. I was too terrified to even scream, and everything felt surreal. The man came within 4 feet of me and then lunged at me. He threw his arms around my waist and literally tackled me to the floor. Then I did scream, but the man didn't let go. His mouth was right by my ear and he kept shushing me and told me it was all okay and not to worry. My life was literally flashing before my eyes when the next thing I knew, the man let out a scream of pain. I felt his weight lift off of me as he rolled over and knocked into some of the speakers. There, standing over me, was my savior, Jeremy. Jeremy bent down and grabbed the man by his shirt, telling him to effing leave me alone and that he wasn't getting away. The man tried to run out of the room, but Jeremy wouldn't let him. This obviously caused a commotion and a few of the customers screamed outside. An actual cop showed up a minute or 2 later and came in and arrested the man. Meanwhile, Frank had come back inside, and although he didn't seem to care too much about my well-being, he had to take what was happening seriously. I decided to quit then and there. Whether Frank was able to load everything up in time wasn't my problem. There were also only 2 or 3 weeks left before the start of my senior year, and hanging out with my friends more seemed like a great idea. Needless to say, I will be forever grateful to Jeremy. Unlike a lot of people I know, Jeremy was completely a stand-up guy, and even if that man had had a knife or gun, I have no doubt he would have still risked his life to save me. We both testified in court, but I never kept up with Jeremy after that. Wherever he is, I hope he's doing well. I still think about what happened from time to time, sometimes more than others, and the image of that man walking towards me and grabbing me will always be in the back of my mind. I'm now in college, and I always carry pepper spray and a blunt object with me at all times. I don't mean to sound disparaging to men, because just like everyone else, they can be good and bad. But what happened just goes to show how quickly a creepy encounter can turn into a terrifying one. My name's Brad, and my wife Cherie and I have one daughter, Stephanie. When the story takes place, she was 4 years old. Stephanie has always been very outgoing and assertive, and is never afraid to speak up. So when my wife and I informed her we'd be visiting an extended family in Wisconsin, Steph wouldn't take no for an answer when she insisted we take a road trip. For context, we'd never taken a longer road trip before, mostly because we wanted to avoid a longer car ride when Stephanie was little. However, the topic had come up before, and probably out of curiosity, Steph had become fixated on taking one. Now we live in Oklahoma, so it was going to be a decent drive. Cherie tried to have us just take a plane trip, but like I said, Stephanie wouldn't take no for an answer. So one evening, we loaded up the family car, a Volkswagen Passat, and set out on the road the next day. Because this was Stephanie's first road trip and she was still a little kid, we planned to take things slow and see a lot of landmarks along the way. The Arch in St. Louis and some of the sites in Chicago were definitely on the list. About halfway through the way there, somewhere in southern Illinois, something happened which we were absolutely not prepared for. We'd stayed in St. Louis the night before and had just checked out of our hotel room at like 9 a.m. Stephanie had made it a mission to try each of the different foods and drinks at the complimentary breakfast. And honestly, both me and my wife were blown away by how much food she put away. Right before lunchtime, Stephanie said she had to pee and started to get antsy, so we looked for a place to pull over. There was an exit which had a large number of accommodations, so we pulled off there. While Stephanie and my wife argued a bit about where to stop and eat, I continued to drive slowly down the street. Then a mall came into view, and Stephanie was dead set about us going there. We figured there'd be at least one thing she'd eat at the food court, and we could all stretch our legs a bit, so we drove over, parked, and went inside. This was the middle of the day, and the mall was practically deserted, and as we walked up to it, we realized how tiny it was. When we walked through the automatic doors, we were met with a distinctive odor. I'm not sure what it was, and it wasn't necessarily bad, just weird. We were also greeted with a little atrium-type area with a fountain and pool area surrounded by 4 planters, and there were benches in a diamond shape around that. Stephanie ran over to it, and when we got there, we saw the hallways on either side were extremely short. There were only a few stores, and some of them appeared to be closing down. One of the stores had religious items, including some sitting in the hallway, and there was also a thrift clothes store. On one end of a hallway we saw what was apparently a movie theater, but there was a gate down in front of it, so we assumed it was closed. It also looked abandoned. On the other end was just a wall. Needless to say, there wasn't a food court. Steph started to climb on one of the planters, and my wife told her to step down. We started to talk about what to do about lunch when Stephanie ran over to the area on the other side of the fountain and started yelling. There was a series of doors with black plastic on them, and I assumed that meant that whatever had been there was closed, but apparently it wasn't. Stephanie was able to open one of the doors, and Cherie and I walked quickly over to her and we all peeked inside. It was a trampoline park, with these large colorful areas where kids could run around. There were also a few arcade games and an inflatable slide scattered against one of the walls. I knew Cherie didn't want to go in, but as Stephanie already started running inside, we had to. There was a front desk with items like what you would buy with tickets, and Stephanie was crouched down and pointing things out already. There wasn't anyone by the front counter when we walked in, but a minute later a middle-aged woman came out from inside of the employees only area. She seemed very disinterested in helping us, and quietly asked us if we needed anything. Before my wife could say no, Stephanie said she wanted this noisemaker and to use the bathroom. The lady said that we could only use the bathroom if we paid for admission, which was apparently just $10 for all of us for the whole day. We decided to buy it so Stephanie could use the restroom, and then we could drive to one of the fast food places to get lunch before returning and spending an hour or two here. After visiting the bathrooms, which were surprisingly decently clean, we had to basically restrain Stephanie on the way out as we walked past the inflatable slide and arcade games. We went to the McDonald's down the street, all the while Steph pleading with us to hurry up so we could get back. At one point my wife had to threaten that if she wasn't quiet we wouldn't go back, and thankfully, or unthankfully, that worked to keep Steph quiet. We walked back inside and Stephanie ran over to the slide while my wife and I walked around to see what else was inside, all the while keeping an eye on Steph. This place was actually kind of big, and I'm pretty sure it was a full-sized anchor space. It had these long rectangular trampoline areas that curved up at the ends, with padding between each trampoline. There was also a pretty large area filled up with foam blocks and equipment like monkey bars and tight ropes where you could try to walk over. But as we were walking around, I almost let out a yell when I turned a corner to see a man standing right on the other side. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and looked to be in his late 30s. He was wearing a black t-shirt and shorts and was moderately overweight. I almost jumped as our eyes met, and it was extremely awkward. I managed to say something like, "Hey," and the man made a gesture with his eyebrows. I quickly walked around him and continued over to the foam block area. When I looked back, he was still just standing there, facing the same direction. I almost got the impression that he was deliberately waiting around the corner to surprise someone, but why, I had no idea. I should also mention that there were like 2 other kids with their parents there, so this place was pretty much deserted. I walked around another way and came back to Cherie, who was watching Steph jump on the trampolines. I asked her if she saw the man, and she shook her head. She asked who I was referring to, and I told her about the guy. My wife seemed slightly concerned now, and as an overprotective father, honestly I was too. Somehow I had this strange feeling that if I looked around I'd see the man standing somewhere, and I was right. On the other side of the trampoline area, behind the netting, was the man. Like before, he was just standing there, only this time he appeared to be watching Stephanie. Now I don't consider myself a confrontational person, but I decided to ask the man what he was doing there. I walked around the trampoline area to find him still standing in that same position, still seemingly looking at Stephanie. I started off by saying, "Hey, how's it going?" And the man turned to look at me. He had a faint smile, and it was hard to read him. He said "hey" in a quiet voice, and a moment later turned back to face the trampolines. I fully expected him to say something else, but he didn't. I still didn't appreciate that he was apparently watching my daughter, but it dawned on me that this man might have some kind of mental issue, and I didn't want to get physical, at least not yet. I decided to ask him if he came here often, and the man's answer surprised me. He said, "Every day," very nonchalantly. I asked him if he worked here, and he said no. Now I was genuinely starting to get creeped out, but as this man continued to watch Stephanie, I didn't just want to leave. I asked him if he ever used the trampolines and gestured there. The man turned back and said, "Yes." I asked, "Do you like this place?" But before the man could answer, I heard Steph yelling and saw her and my wife run out of the trampoline area and into the foam block area. The man was still looking directly ahead at the now empty trampolines. Maybe he wasn't watching Stephanie after all. I honestly didn't know what else to ask him, and I didn't want to get more confrontational, so I just said something like "see ya" and walked away towards the foam blocks. Like before, when I was further away and turned around, I still saw him at that same location. The man eventually left my field of view as I walked up next to Cherie and quietly told her about my conversation. I suggested that we leave soon, and she was completely on board with that. Watching me talk to the man on the other side of the trampolines had creeped her out too. We both stood there watching Stephanie, laughing and jumping off this large gymnastic mat into the blocks below. I announced that we need to leave in 10 minutes, and though Stephanie protested, she kept playing. All the while, Cherie and I would periodically walk back towards where the man was standing, and sure enough, he was still there, looking at the trampolines. 10 minutes later, and it was time to go. Because we had already eaten lunch and were getting back on the road, we were all going to use the restrooms. We were also going to walk over as a group, given that the man was still there. As I anticipated, getting Steph out of the foam blocks was going to be an ordeal, but I was not prepared for what would happen next. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed some of the foam blocks moving. At first I was completely baffled, but when I realized what was going on, my blood ran cold. The movement got closer to Stephanie, and then in a moment that's burned into my memory, I heard Stephanie scream and get pulled downward. I screamed too and dove into the foam blocks. Sure enough, I felt a large object underneath me, which was indeed the man. I started punching and kept screaming, and he let go of Stephanie immediately. Cherie was screaming too and dove in after me. She got to Stephanie, who was bawling her eyes out, and pulled her over to the side of the pit and lifted her up. After they were back up on the side, I reached down and grabbed the man and started to drag him out too. The man didn't put up much resistance, and I got him out relatively easily. The man didn't put up much of a fight, and I held him against the padding next to the pit. I told Cherie and Stephanie to go to the front desk and call 911. That's what they did, and the cops arrived 15 minutes later. All the while I had the guy pinned, and he just looked up at the ceiling with this blank expression on his face. Eventually the cops came and put the guy in cuffs, and we walked outside of the trampoline park. As we left, I caught a glimpse of that same lady at the front desk, who looked completely indifferent to what was going on. That made me pretty upset, and I said something like, "That man shouldn't have even been here and I want a refund." The lady actually gave us back our money, all in that same nonchalant manner. I figured the best thing for us to do was get back on the road, which is exactly what we did. It took us all an hour or two to calm down, but eventually we acknowledged more of what just happened, and then shifted the conversation back on what we planned to see on our trip. It definitely cast a shadow over our plans, but thankfully nothing else even remotely like that happened, and we were able to enjoy ourselves. I still think about that man every so often, along with that image of Stephanie getting pulled down into the foam blocks. As a parent, something like that is essentially your worst fear, and I'm just glad I was able to rescue her in time. I worked at a kiosk in a mall for a while. You know, those things with a bunch of tacky and overpriced toys? Yep, I worked there. Or rather, I usually just sat on my phone there. It was extremely boring, but as a teenager, I enjoyed the extra money. Most of our customers were little kids accompanied by their parents, but there were also teenagers who occasionally tried to steal stuff. However, I was almost always able to stop them, and in some way I even liked the excitement. Our mall wasn't ever too busy except for the holiday seasons, and when I worked at the kiosk late on weekday evenings, it was basically dead. Sometimes I'd get up and visit with the workers at the nearby kiosks, while keeping my own within eyesight, but honestly I didn't vibe with the other workers. There was a watch place with two middle-aged dudes that barely spoke English, and on the other side was a middle-aged woman who was extremely quiet and would just sit there with this blank expression on her face. So, I was basically left there on my phone. However, one day the monotony was broken up, in a way stranger than I could have imagined. Around 6 o'clock on a weekday, this woman walked over to my kiosk. She looked like she was in her late 30s or possibly early 40s. The woman was on the skinny side, though not too skinny, and was dressed in a blazer, t-shirt, and black pants, and wore sneakers. I feel kind of dirty saying this, and maybe this was just because I was 16, but I'd say she was attractive. She didn't seem to be there with anyone, so I assumed she was getting a gift for a party or someone's birthday. I looked up and said hello, and she greeted me very enthusiastically. That almost caught me off guard, partly because no one had even come up to me for the past hour or so. She immediately asked me my name, and I told her it was Jared. The woman said nice to meet you, and introduced herself as Becky. I said it was nice to meet her too, and asked her if she wanted to get anything. This is where the conversation started to get stranger. Becky said she was just browsing, and when I asked her if there was some special occasion, she told me no. All the while, she kept speaking very enthusiastically, and it was starting to weird me out a bit. I expected Becky to walk around the kiosk looking for something to buy. We had what I guess was a decent selection, including some plastic Minecraft swords and bows, Poppy Playtime dolls, random balls, and squirt guns. You know, like every other mall you've ever been to. But Becky didn't walk around though. Instead, she just kept standing there, looking right at me. I expected her to continue the conversation, since she seemed to be very outgoing, but she didn't. As we looked at each other, I started to get unnerved at her facial expression. Becky's eyes were open wider than usual and didn't look around periodically. They were literally locked on me. She was smiling, only something looked off about it. It seemed to be slightly deranged. A few seconds passed and I couldn't take it anymore. While still looking her in the eye, I asked again if she wanted to get anything. Becky smiled more and after a moment said, "Not right now." Then she just turned around and walked off. I watched her as she made her way down the main hallway and passed by the escalators going up to the food court on the second level. I expected her to go into one of the other stores to look for whatever she came here for, but she didn't. She just walked all the way to the end of the hall where I assumed she went out the entrance. I closed down the kiosk right before 8, which was when the mall closed, and started walking back to my car. It was this really old beater my parents gave me right after I turned 16. I'd usually park next to the side entrance since it was closest to the kiosk. When I walked outside, I couldn't help but notice this red car parked at the very edge of the parking lot next to where it backed up to an area with trees. It started moving right when I got in my car and then drove off. Based on the strangeness of that encounter earlier, my brain made the connection that maybe it was that lady. If it was, that meant she either left and came back or else waited there for almost 2 hours. I thought about it on the way home and periodically checked for that car, but I never saw it. Eventually I put the lady out of my mind, and after watching a movie on Netflix, I went to my room and fell asleep. The next day when I got there around 11, I couldn't help but wonder if that lady was going to show up again. For a bit of context, I'd worked at the kiosk for about 3 months at this point, and this was the only strange thing to really happen. I kind of wanted her to show up, just out of curiosity, because it broke up the monotony. She didn't, nor did she come in the rest of the week, and I figured she got whatever she came here for. Then the next week, I think it was a Tuesday, Becky came back. It was right after 6 o'clock again, and this time I saw her enter the hall from that same entrance and walk towards me. She came up to the kiosk and greeted me, exactly like before, then asked how I was doing. I told her I was doing alright and asked how she had been doing. She said she was doing fine and asked me how I'd been, which, to me, seemed like the same question. I couldn't help but notice that Becky was wearing rather revealing clothing, a tank top and what I think were tennis shorts. My hormone-related reaction aside, this seemed very strange to me. I had imagined her as someone's mom, since I thought she'd been shopping for little kids' toys, but maybe that wasn't the case. I told Becky I'd been good, and then asked her if she found a present. Becky laughed and told me she wasn't looking for anything. Okay, why was she here? Now maybe this was my teenage brain talking, but I made the connection that maybe she thought I was attractive and just wanted to talk to me. It should go without saying that this would be extremely creepy, and most likely illegal if somehow things went further. Even though I didn't have a girlfriend and was a little lonely, I knew I wasn't going to go anywhere or do anything with this woman. With Becky still standing there and looking at me, I asked her if there was something specifically at this kiosk that she wanted, and that's when she smiled and said, "You." Well, that confirmed my suspicion, but I also wasn't prepared to handle the rest of this conversation. I looked down and said thanks, followed by, "I'm just here to help." Then Becky asked me if I wanted to get coffee at the food court. Even in this bizarre situation, I was surprised at how forward she was being. I tried my best to politely tell her no and that I needed to stay where I was. She made this sad expression and then walked off. This time she walked to the escalator, but 5 minutes later she came back down and started walking towards me. I noticed she had 2 cups of coffee and a big smile on her face. I think I should have been more freaked out at this point, but one more time, I was 16. Becky walked up to the counter on the kiosk, set the coffee down, and playfully said, "I got you something." I didn't know if I should accept it or not, as I didn't want things to escalate, so I just said thank you and left it sitting there. Then for like the 5th time there was another awkward pause. I almost thought she was getting upset, but then with that same smile she asked me when I got off of work. This is where I started to really want things to end. It didn't help that I didn't really talk to the 2 other neighbors in the mall and there was no one else around where we were. I tried to tell Becky I left when the mall closed in a calm voice so she'd get the hint I wasn't interested. But it kept going. She offered to give me a ride and I turned her down. Then she asked if I drove or had someone drop me off. At this point I was giving one-word answers and hoping to God she'd just walk away. But nothing could prepare me for where this conversation was about to go. Becky continued to stare at me, then nonchalantly mentioned that she was depressed and her husband wasn't supportive of her. And then she mentioned that she was getting electroshock therapy. That was it. I had now exhausted my entire list of replies and was completely at a loss for words. I think I said, "I'm sorry," before getting up to go for a walk. I had to. I didn't want to stay at my seat for another second. Becky just stood there at the kiosk, watching me. I decided to go to the mall office, which was up the escalators by the food court. I didn't care that I was leaving the kiosk unattended. Unfortunately, when I got there, it was already closed, so I went around looking for one of our mall cops. I didn't really talk to them either, but as far as I knew, they did a decent job of patrolling the mall. Eventually I found one, a skinny older guy who I think was named Bob. I told Bob there was a lady who was stalking me at my kiosk, and he followed me down there. When we got off the escalator, I saw Becky was still there. Apparently she was just staring off into space, but when she noticed us walking towards her, she waved. I didn't return the wave, and Bob asked in a rather gruff voice if he could help her. Like she originally told me, Becky said she was just browsing, and then I mentioned to Bob how that was the first thing she told to me. Bob approached her and said she needed to make a purchase or go ahead and leave the mall. Much to my surprise, Becky didn't seem to get upset. Instead, she just smiled that same creepy smile, picked up her coffee cup, and began to walk off. Bob and I stood there watching her go. I kinda wanted Bob to follow her outside, but he stayed with me instead. Eventually Becky reached the entrance at the end of the hall and apparently walked outside. Bob didn't say much, and only told me to watch out for her before going back to the escalators. It was like 7 now, and though I would have packed up then and there, I didn't want to leave immediately in case she was waiting outside. Instead, I left right at 8. I looked for Bob in hopes I could convince him to walk outside with me, but I couldn't find him, so I just left. My heart rate quickened when I made my way through the doors, and immediately I scanned my surroundings for the red car. I couldn't see it anywhere. Therefore, I walked quickly to my car, got inside, and drove back to my parents' house. I can't describe the sensation I felt when I pulled onto our street and saw the red car parked in front of our house. And I don't mean it was parked by our house or on the other side of the street. No, it was literally right next to the curb of our front lawn. That was also where I usually parked, because my parents didn't want me to park in the driveway. My blood ran cold as the extent of this woman's stalking started to sink in, along with the fact that she knew where I lived and was in fact here. I contemplated my options for a moment. Based on her comments and actions, I knew she had mental issues and was most likely nuts, though up to this point she hadn't been physically aggressive. I considered getting out of my car and confronting her, but I decided to pull over on the next block to call my parents. I did so, and when my mom picked up the house phone and I explained the situation, she started freaking out. She told me to call 911, and that's exactly what I did. The cops actually showed up to my location within 5 minutes, and we greeted each other and then drove back to my house. When the cops parked and walked over to her car, Becky opened the door and got out. If I had any doubt that the car belonged to her, it was now completely gone. The cops started to question her, but in that same enthusiastic voice, she explained that we'd met each other at the mall and that she wanted to get to know me more. A few moments later, my mom came outside of our front door and walked aggressively up to where they were standing. The cops advised the woman that she was on private property and that since she wasn't invited, she needed to leave immediately. She agreed, and without even acknowledging my mom's presence, Becky got back into her car and drove away. After watching her drive down the block, we all came inside where the cops asked us more questions. I explained everything that happened both times I had seen her, along with what she'd said about her husband. The police said they'd file a report, and that we could press charges for trespassing if she returned to our home, or stalking if she continued to visit me at the mall. However, they told us there wasn't much they could do at the moment. My mom insisted that I not return to the mall, and when my dad got home, he agreed that it might not be a bad idea. However, because I still wanted to get paid, I ended up continuing to work there for several more months. I was still paranoid whenever I went to work and then came home, half expecting her car to be there at either place, but it wasn't. Now the story might end there, but I'm not exactly sure. 2 weeks after these events transpired, I happened to randomly look up to the second level and noticed a woman looking down at me. She had brown hair, like Becky's, though it was cut a bit shorter, and the woman was wearing sunglasses and a coat. Like Becky, she didn't seem to be there with anyone, and I couldn't tell what she was looking at. My glance stayed on her for a few seconds before she looked and walked away. I thought about going to the mall office, since this was in the middle of the day and it would most likely be open, but I wasn't sure enough that it was Becky. Ultimately, I stayed at the kiosk, just checking my surroundings frequently. I think that really was the end of the story. The more time that passes, the sadder I feel about Becky. Sure, her hitting on and stalking me was insanely creepy and possibly dangerous, but she also seemed genuine when she told me about her depression and unsupportive husband. I have no way of knowing what her life experiences were, and maybe her husband was abusive and she was just looking for some kind of outlet, even if it wasn't appropriate. Maybe she thought I was older. In any case, I just hope that wherever she is, she's getting the help and support she needs. I've since graduated college and moved to another state and settled down with a family of my own. This experience is now just a footnote of my youth, and it doesn't really bother me. But sometimes, I can't help but wonder, will Becky ever find me again somehow? And if she did, what would she do?